Hello, I'm Dr. Bridget Nash, and I'd like to welcome you to The Therapy Show, a podcast series that seeks to demystify mental health treatment. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. John Krystal, who is the Robert L. McNeil Jr. Professor of Translational Research, Psychiatry and Neuroscience at Yale School of Medicine, the chair in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale-New Haven Hospital, and the director of the Clinical Neuroscience Division at the Department of Veterans Affairs, National Center for PTSD. He is a leading expert in the areas of alcoholism, schizophrenia, depression, and the neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the topic we will discuss today. Dr. Krystal's work is interdisciplinary and links psychopharmacology, neuroimaging, molecular genetics, and computational neuroscience to study the neurobiology and treatment of these disorders. He is best known for leading the discovery of the rapid antidepressant effects of ketamine in depressed patients. Dr. Krystal, welcome to The Therapy Show.
Well, thank you, Bridget. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your personal background and professional development that led to your research in the field of the neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is more commonly referred to as PTSD?
Sure. I grew up in Detroit, and my father was a Holocaust survivor who was the only surviving member of his family. After he came to the United States, he became a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and his work was devoted to the adjustment issues faced by Holocaust survivors. That had a tremendous effect on my career development, as PTSD was something of great interest to me throughout my life. When I entered college and medical school, I became very interested in neurobiology. And when I started medical school, I started working with veterans with PTSD and found an opportunity to link my interest in studying the brain with my interest in post-traumatic stress disorder. And so from very early in my career, studying the neurobiology and treatment of PTSD has been just a core part of my work.
So how would you briefly explain PTSD to a non-professional?
I think there are two ways to describe PTSD to a non-professional. And the first and the least useful is to go to the shelf and get the diagnostic manual, which is called DSM-5 for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, and to go through the checklist of symptoms. And the reason I don't think that's always a good place to begin is because I think for most people who've gone through something very terrible in their lives, they have a sense of how that terrible experience has shaped their lives, the kinds of symptoms and problems that they've had, the kinds of struggles or interpersonal difficulties they've had. Sometimes these difficulties have spread into other areas of their life, perhaps related to addiction or chronic pain or other kinds of complications. Where I often begin with people in talking about PTSD is to try to help them to understand the link between their traumatic experiences and the symptoms or problems that they've been facing in their life. And after we understand their own life story, then we can go to the diagnostic manual and often show them how their own personal experiences of psychological trauma map onto what the pattern that many people have that's reflected in the diagnostic manual.
Can you talk about what is happening in the brain when a trauma event occurs?
Well, we have survived in evolution because we're really good at figuring out what is safe and what's dangerous. And the simplest way to think about the neurobiology of PTSD is to understand that there are brain circuits whose job it is to help us recognize even subtle threats to our survival and to highlight those and to react strongly to them so they capture our attention and to take action of one or another kind. In other words, to fight or flight, flee that threat. So one of the things that happens in PTSD is that this system becomes a bit out of control. And what I mean by that is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's critically important in our lives to be able to tell when we're safe and when we're under threat. And what happens oftentimes in PTSD is that we've learned so powerfully from the terrible situations that we've been exposed to, that danger is looming, that the ability to tell when we're really under threat or where we're only reminded of the terrible thing that happened to us earlier, that goes away. So people are experiencing themselves as vulnerable. They're experiencing themselves as sometimes in danger or overwhelmed by the threat they experience in their life. And that's represented in the brain because there are circuits in the brain that are, as I mentioned earlier, that are involved in the recognition of threat and in mobilizing our behavior to respond to that. So when I think of the circuitry of post-traumatic stress disorder, I think of an area of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is in the limbic system, which is a part of the brain that's involved in mood. And it helps to more mobilize and orchestrate our response to threatening situations that we're exposed to. The amygdala's partner, in a way, is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex plays a role in recognizing and orchestrating the response to stress, but it often is controlling the amygdala. In other words, you could imagine a conversation between the amygdala, which is in a more primitive part of the brain, saying something like, "It's dangerous out there, watch out. It's dangerous, be careful, run away." And the prefrontal cortex saying, yes, it could be a little bit dangerous, but we can manage it, or we can control it, or we don't need to run. So that there's a crosstalk between the prefrontal cortex, which understands threat in context and guides the decisions that we make, and the amygdala, which is the more primitive survival part of the brain that's driving the anxiety. Now, there are many other parts of the brain that are involved in this circuit. So, for example, there are regions of the brain involved in developing what kind of mood we're experiencing. So there's an area called the insula that's fine-tuning the output of the amygdala and telling us whether we're angry or ashamed or sad or bereaved. And another part of the brain called the cingulate cortex that's involved in the execution of the emotional state. I'm slightly oversimplifying things, but the way that I'm describing it, you can imagine that there are different parts of the brain that are communicating with each other and that our overall response to stress is coordinated by these networks. And in PTSD, these networks are not working in a way that's very adaptive for us. Some of the interesting questions that come up are, what is the molecular biology? In other words, why at the molecular level are these different parts of the brain not working in such great adaptive harmony? Another thing that happens in the brain is that contributes not so much to the generation of PTSD, but to the chronicity and the overall impact of PTSD, is that when the brain is under a severe chronic stress for a long period of time, one of the consequences of that is that the body is experiencing being bathed, the brain is being bathed in cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and it activates our immune system, and various chemicals of our immune system are released as if some kind of physical attack is going to cause an infection and we had to fight it off. And so our body is bathed in cortisol and what are called the immune molecules called cytokines. And together, these chemicals chew up some of the synaptic connections in our brain. And there are other factors involved as well, and which I'll comment on in just a little bit. So what happens is that the connections between nerve cells, the way the brain, you can think of the brain as a complicated computer where one chip is communicating to another chip through thousands of fine connections. Well, the same thing happens in the brain when it starts to lose these synaptic connections, as happens on your computer when you start to lose the fine connections, which is that the signal gets a little bit noisy, and the plasticity, in other words, in the brain, the ability to mold circuits as a consequence of experience, that plasticity becomes a little bit reduced. And so we think that synaptic loss both contributes to some of the cognitive symptoms of PTSD, the impairments in attention, the impairments in learning and memory, some reduction in the ability to learn more adaptive modes of emotional function. So that there are sort of two parts of the biology of PTSD as we see it now that seem to feed off each other. First, aberrant forms of learning that make it hard for people to tell the difference between when they're safe and when they're under threat. And the other part of the biology of PTSD, which are the reductions in synaptic connectivity, the communication between the nerve cells that make the circuits a little bit noisy, a little bit less precise, a little bit less adaptive. And those two processes kind of feed off each other. The interesting thing for me, one of the interesting things about our work is that we're trying to find neural signatures of both of these processes using brain imaging. So using a technology called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a cousin, if you will, of the typical MRI scans, we can evaluate the activity of brain circuits in people with PTSD and show that the ability to mobilize these fear circuits or trauma or stress circuits in the brain is altered in people with PTSD. We can show that the structure, size of certain parts of the brain is a little bit reduced in people with PTSD. And most recently, using PET scans, positron emission tomography, we've been able to document for the first time that people who have both severe depression and PTSD actually have reductions in a marker of synaptic density in various parts of the brain. So we're learning a little bit about the biology of PTSD. We've been studying the biology of PTSD since the late 80s in a more sophisticated way. And we're beginning to piece together a story that helps us to think about the biology of PTSD. This line of research is going to take an important step forward as a result of a new initiative called the National VA PTSD Brain Bank. It's a national PTSD brain bank. And so for the first time in the history of the field of post-traumatic stress disorder research, we now have brain tissue from people who had post-traumatic stress disorder that we can compare to brain tissue from people who did not have PTSD or who did not have any diagnosed psychiatric disorder. And we can study the actual molecular biology, the molecules in those tissues and the genes and how they're regulated. And we have submitted the first big paper from that initial analysis for publication. I won't give any details from it, but suffice it to say that the data are suggesting that PTSD has many, many important differences that make it unique and not like major depression, even though both major depression and PTSD can be associated with the symptom of depression. And the second thing that seems to be very important that we're finding is that there are differences in the neurobiology of PTSD in men and women. And we're just at the beginning of trying to understand that. But it may have implications for the pattern of PTSD symptoms and the effectiveness of treatments that we might develop for men and women. So in some ways, you could say that the studies of the neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder are just beginning, because it's only when the studies have a certain level of sophistication that they have the possibility of informing the way we think about personalizing treatments to the specific biology of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Can you also talk about what's happening in the body when a trauma event occurs and even afterwards?
Sure. There was a time in history, for example, in the time of the philosopher René Descartes, where we thought that there was a biology of the body that was distinct from the mind. And that you could, in subsequent work, that you could draw a very clear line between the brain and the body in terms of understanding the response to stress. But the reality is that the brain is one of the main organizers of the biology of the entire body. And many, many processes that are present in the body shape the brain. So, for example, I mentioned that the release of cortisol and the release of inflammatory cytokines in the body could have an effect on brain structure and function. Similarly, the brain and the output of the brain is influencing the pattern of our breathing, the way we sleep, the beating of our heart, the release of stress hormones and stress chemicals in the body. And what's interesting is that there are loops between the biology of the body and the biology of the brain that we're just beginning to appreciate. So, for example, one of our colleagues, former colleagues at Yale, Doug Bremner, and his wife, Viola Vaccarino, just published a very interesting study in which they showed that when people have underlying heart disease and they're exposed to psychological stress, that psychological stress produces a stress on the heart that contributes to ischemia of the heart. In other words, that psychological stress in vulnerable people with, say, PTSD could put them at greater risk of having a heart attack. That's an idea that's certainly been around for a long time, but actually demonstrating that through imaging of the body and brain is really very fascinating. Another area of great interest has been something called the microbiome. And these are the bacteria that live in our gut. And there's no question that stress influences the regulation of the gut and influences the organisms that thrive in the gut. And similarly, there's evidence that the pattern of organisms that are in your gut influences inflammation, the propensity for inflammation in the body. So, for example, some of these organisms can penetrate the lining of the gut. They can cause some leaking in the gut in terms of the boundary of the gut and the body and stimulate inflammation in the body. Inflammation is a really very interesting core process contributing to illness. In the body, inflammation contributes to heart disease, atherosclerosis, asthma, arthritis, various forms of chronic pain. In the brain, the same stress-related inflammation can contribute to the loss of synaptic connections and imprecision in the regulation of various processes in the brain and therefore in the body. So the response to PTSD, just at the level of the overall stress response, is an organismal stress response. It involves your entire body. However, people who have PTSD, as I alluded to earlier, are often prone to two problems that really three problems in reality that heighten the complexity and importance of the interplay between the brain and the rest of the body. The first two common issues are that the very situations that cause psychological trauma often cause physical trauma to your body. A physical trauma to your body could result in a chronic pain syndrome. A physical trauma to your head could produce traumatic brain injury. And the chronic pain syndrome in the body complicates the recovery because, number one, chronic pain is associated with a lot of inflammation in the body. And secondly, because it's a context where people who are under extreme stress are exposed to and often need to take opiates for pain. And that sets them up for addiction risk because the management of pain, the opiates don't necessarily differentiate whether they're managing your psychological pain or your physical pain. And so people with PTSD symptoms are sometimes vulnerable to take opiates to manage their psychological pain, and that puts them at risk for addiction. The second kind of trauma that I mentioned, which is traumatic brain injury, is a very common complication because whether it's people driving a Humvee and having an IED explode and their physical trauma there, or a physical attack where people are maybe struck in the head, sometimes repeatedly, these situations are set up for traumatic brain injury. So as I mentioned, particularly in the context of chronic PTSD, you have already, as part of PTSD, a compromise of synaptic connectivity. When you add traumatic brain injury to that, the stretching of synaptic connectivity, the even rending and loss sometimes of connectivity in the brain, you can see that the process of post-traumatic stress disorder and the process of traumatic brain injury are adding insult to injury and making people have even a harder time focusing their attention, even a harder time staying engaged in the work that they need to do, having an even harder time managing their anger or impulses, having an even harder time focusing their memory and other aspects of behavior regulation. So we think of post-traumatic stress disorder and the biology of post-traumatic stress disorder as an illness and recovery, but it's also helpful to think about post-traumatic stress disorder and its associated problems as a challenge to resilience. In other words, the ability to cope in the everyday life that we all experience. And we can focus on what those challenges are to coping and help people to develop skills that manage those problems. What's particularly been exciting for me as we've studied the biology of post-traumatic stress disorder is the idea that we might also be able to help resilience from the perspective of restoring the synaptic connections in the brain. In other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that just because PTSD and traumatic brain injury might cause a loss of some synaptic connectivity or efficiency of connectivity, doesn't necessarily mean the case that that has to be permanent. And some of the exciting work in neuroscience is coming from trying to think of what are those mechanisms that the brain uses to rebuild synaptic connections in the brain. So, for example, the brain has a variety of factors called nerve growth factors. That's actually a name for one of the chemicals, but we call them neurotrophic factors. Neurotrophic means nerve growth factors. One of them is nerve growth factor, but that happens to be not the one that we're most interested in. There are compounds called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, and there's another one called vasoendothelial growth factor, VEGF, and there are several others. And it turns out that if we give a drug called ketamine, we can very rapidly cause a rise in the level of nerve growth factor. And as a consequence of that, in animals, you can actually see it under the microscope, that some of the synaptic connections that are lost as a consequence of stress will grow back in animal models of stress. And in humans, what we can see is that people with severe depression have reductions in functional connectivity, the coordination of communication between various parts of the brain. In 24 hours after a single dose of ketamine, you see that those impairments in communication among areas of the brain tend to be reduced. In other words, the normal function tends to be restored. Along with this, our laboratory showed now over 20 years ago that a single dose of ketamine for some people will improve their symptoms of depression. And actually, that work has gone on, and there's now a form of ketamine called S-ketamine, which is approved by the FDA for treating the symptoms of so-called treatment-resistant depression, or the treatment-resistant symptoms of depression. My colleague, Dennis Charney, who was the previous director of the Clinical Neuroscience Division of the National Center for PTSD, and now the dean of the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, he and his collaborators did a pilot study of ketamine in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Their findings were really very interesting because what they found was that even when you controlled for the antidepressant effect of ketamine, above that, for the people that they studied, there was a positive effect on the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we thought that that was really very important. And so we're now in the middle, or actually towards the end of a large study where we've enrolled well over 100 subjects, where we're looking at the effects of ketamine, of repeated doses of ketamine to treat the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, one of the exciting developments to come out of this work, both the animal work and the human work, and let me just say that much of what we understand about the biology of ketamine effects in the brain was generated by my colleague, Ronald Duman at Yale, who passed away unexpectedly this year. Ron's work was extremely important in helping us to sort out the particular signaling mechanisms through which ketamine caused the regrowth of synaptic connectivity in the brain. In fact, he discovered that effect of ketamine. But Ron's work also suggested that in the period where you regrew the synaptic connections, that there was an opportunity to intervene at a behavior level to take advantage of the fact that these new synaptic connections were really ready and able to contribute to learning new things about the environment. So, for example, animals who had been conditioned to be afraid of a stimulus, you could extinguish that fear much more rapidly in this window, beginning 24 hours after a dose of ketamine and lasting about a week, where there was enhanced plasticity of the brain. So our colleague at the National Center for PTSD, Ilan Harpaz-Rotem, is in the middle of doing a study where he takes advantage of that, where people get a dose of ketamine and then they extinguish aspects of their traumatic reactions. Now, when people hear about this kind of work, the idea that you could extinguish fear or change a traumatic memory, they often become very worried that this kind of treatment, or in fact any kind of treatment, might in some way take away memories they have of the trauma in a way that they don't want. Traumatic memories are often the last memories of people that they care a great deal about. So, for example, you would not want to forget your fellow platoon members at a terrible moment, or you might not want to forget the last drive you had with a spouse prior to a car accident or something like that. We don't have the ability to take away memories. That's not the way that these kinds of treatments work. Instead, what they do is help us to lay new information over old information so that we can learn new things about our former traumatic events. Like, we might feel very guilty if we were a soldier and our platoon was overrun and we failed to save someone who was a good friend. You might feel very guilty about not having saved that person. But if you lay new information over that, like, it was impossible for me to save that person, or I wasn't even barely able to save myself, let alone save anybody else. You know, if you can reframe these traumatic memories in realistic ways, it's often very helpful. It takes a lot of the burden and the pressure off of the impact of the trauma, and people can cope overall much better, even though they haven't forgotten the traumas. And even though the traumas, if they think about it, are still upsetting. But we're promoting people's capacity to manage the memories, to put them in their rightful place, and to be able to focus on the things that are in front of them in their daily lives.
When do you think these treatments will be widely available?
Well, my feeling about ketamine as a treatment for PTSD is that if people are having severe symptoms of depression, it's already appropriate to get ketamine treatment for treatment-resistant symptoms of the depression. That's already in line with what the FDA has approved. However, as a treatment for PTSD, in my view, it is still a research experiment, and relatively few people with post-traumatic stress disorder have been studied with ketamine. And so my suggestion there would be to try to find a place that's doing research on post-traumatic stress disorder. It's hard to know whether the FDA will ever be presented with a data set by a company that would lead the FDA to make a specific indication for FDA approval for PTSD. But my guess is that over time, the evidence will accumulate and a consensus will develop about whether or not ketamine treatment is as effective for PTSD as it seems to be for the standard treatment-resistant symptoms of depression. My guess is that's going to take somewhere between 3 and 5 years.
So why is it important that therapists who are treating individuals with PTSD have some formal training in this complex disorder before they work in the field?
I think there's two answers, one historical and the other practical. The historical issue with post-traumatic stress disorder was that when it was not well understood, there was a terrible problem about clinicians misinterpreting the symptoms and experiences that people were having with post-traumatic stress disorder. They were interpreted as having personality problems, most commonly something called borderline personality disorder. And they were also interpreted as being malingerers, in other words, faking their symptoms. And in the Department of Veterans Affairs, for example, there were a lot of people who, as a result, couldn't get the services that they needed, either to get eligibility for treatment in the VA, to get disability pensions that they clearly qualified for, and to get the kinds of treatments that they needed to get better. So it's really important for people to understand post-traumatic stress disorder and to have some grounding in the basic treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder so they can recognize the problems as they are detected in their patients and so that they're well equipped to deal with them. There are now several forms of psychotherapy that have been demonstrated to be helpful with many forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's progressive exposure therapy. There's cognitive processing therapy, eye movement desensitization and relaxation therapy. And then there are other therapies as well, including modifications to standard insight-oriented psychotherapy. And these treatments can be extremely helpful for many people with post-traumatic stress disorder. As we find with medications, the same is true with psychotherapies, which is not every medication works for every patient. Not every psychotherapy is a good fit for every patient. But it's really important that people start somewhere. If they need medication, that they start somewhere. Usually people are starting with the standard antidepressant medications. And if they need psychotherapy, they find a therapist that they hear about or that they are referred to or is present in the hospital where they're getting their treatment and start there and work from there. All treatments in mental health, and PTSD is no exception to this, involve a process of discovery. The treater is discovering and better understanding the problems that the person has, the unique problems and contexts that those symptoms arise in, and the unique profile of medications and psychotherapies that can be helpful. The same can be said for the being a patient, which is that you have a process of learning about the doctors or psychotherapists that you're working with to find the ones who seem to understand you best, who provide you the kind of psychotherapy and or medications that seem to work for you, to learn what medications are and which ones seem to help and which ones don't seem to help, so that you can be an educated consumer of treatment and actually an active partner in treatment, which I think is very empowering and helps to deal with one of the problems that sometimes comes up in PTSD, which is that it's hard to be helpless in the context of extreme stress. And it's hard to be helpless on an ongoing basis, to feel helpless in the context of your treatment. That is not a very constructive stance in PTSD treatment. So we want people to be active participants in their treatment. So, for example, many forms of treatments will have homework assignments that people have to do outside of the treatment that help to keep them active in the treatment, is the other ways that this is built into treatments. Because after all, what we're trying to achieve for people is to help them to be able to cope with what they need to deal with and to manage their own thoughts and impulses and reactions, and not to be a victim of their emotional swings or impulses.
Do you think early intervention improves outcomes?
I think early intervention improves everything. I can't think of a single illness where you're best off just ignoring it and, hoping it gets better on its own. The one exception to that is the immediate post-traumatic context, which is that it's important for clinicians and for people who've been through, something really terrible, to right from the start, to be thinking about how to positively frame the experience or to reasonably frame the experience. Because sometimes in the immediate post-traumatic context, well, let me back up to say that the meaning of the trauma is created after the event. You might think that being struck by a car has its own internal meaning, but the meaning that people ascribe to the experience is often very different than just the concrete description of the event. In other words, a person could be driving a car and be struck by someone who is driving the wrong way on the highway and recover from that. One kind of interpretation of that was, I'm not a good driver. I'm out of control on the highway. I'm not looking out for things that are happening. And in the same event, the same person could think of it and say, well, I am a good driver. I am always watching out. I couldn't have predicted this person would come out of nowhere and smash into me. That doesn't change the fact that I am a good driver and comfortable behind the wheel on the highway. Yet those two different interpretations, which can get consolidated shortly after the event, may stick with the person for the rest of their life. So what you don't want to do early in the acute traumatic situation is debrief people in ways that promote the negative, helpless attributions to the event. There used to be a lot of trauma debriefing that essentially turned out to have that effect. And so that kind of treatment isn't very helpful. Getting people on the right path, making sure that they feel safe and supported, and help them to think about what they've been through in a constructive way, that can be helpful. But with that one caveat of not reinforcing the negative attributions, I think early intervention after a trauma can be very helpful.
And even in my clinical practice, I see when people freeze or they immobilize and they blame themselves for not fighting back. Can you speak to that, like how you can reframe that as a protective, adaptive response?
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I didn't say anything about this idea of dissociation. Generally speaking, we have two kinds of responses, as I alluded to earlier, fight and flight. But what I failed to mention is that there's two kinds of flight experiences. One is running away, and the other one is mentally distancing yourself from the trauma. One of the things that can happen under extremely stressful situations is that this dissociative experience, this freezing under stress, takes over. And I agree that some people feel terrible about that. Why didn't they fight back or run away more effectively? But the reality is that people are not in control. You may be in control of the running, and you may be somewhat in control of the fighting, but you're not really in control, unfortunately, of the freezing. It is an evolutionary, evolved response to extremely stressful situations, and we're not really in control of that. Yet one of the most striking things that happens in people who have been traumatized, I mean striking in the sense of it's very memorable when you see it, is that these freezing episodes can come back at other times. In other words, they can become part of the symptoms of PTSD, so that when someone's having a discussion with you, that you zone out and lose contact, or when you're trying to do something under stressful situations, the same kind of thing might occur. And these kinds of dissociative experiences can be very troubling and very maladaptive. And for some people, they become a core part of their symptoms of PTSD. Fortunately, it seems like when people are treated for the whole syndrome of PTSD, that many times that symptom will go away with the other symptoms of PTSD. We're hoping to develop ultimately and to study these dissociative symptoms more, because sometimes the dissociative symptoms kind of hang around a bit and don't always get better in the context of standard treatment. So for some groups of people, survivors of trauma, this kind of feeling that things aren't real, or that they're not really there, or that they're kind of in a spacey area, these can be very distressing symptoms of PTSD. But to get back to your earlier point, what you can do, you can't get rid of the fact that they had this spacey experience, this freezing in the context of the trauma. But you can help them to understand that, number one, it wasn't their fault. They weren't complicit in the trauma because they had the freezing experience. It's involuntary, like breathing or your heartbeat. And the second thing that they should know is that just because they froze one time doesn't mean that they're going to freeze the next time. So that they don't need to carry with them the burden that this freezing experience in the context of trauma is a core feature of their personality. We see many instances where a woman froze during an initial sexual assault, but didn't freeze in a similar context later in their lives. And the good thing is, what it suggests that many people learn constructively from their experiences and are better equipped to face challenges in their life afterwards. There's something called post-traumatic growth, which is the counterpart to post-traumatic stress disorder, where people go through these terrible experiences and they may have some symptoms or problems in their lives, but there may be ways that their lives become enriched by that experience. They have a deeper understanding of how precious human life is, or they get a mission to help other people, other survivors of what they went through, or they have other positive outcomes of their trauma. And the idea that you can make something good out of something bad is really the essence of the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, because people who've been traumatized still have so much to offer the people in their lives and other people, their communities, and they just need to be freed up to realize that potential.
So do people suffering with PTSD have higher rates of suicide?
It's a complicated question to answer because it depends how you analyze the data. But I think the simple answer is yes. And the question is, the more meaningful answers are harder to give. It's like, how much increase? I've seen estimates between 2 and 10 times higher. And that's a huge range. And I'm not very sure what part of that range is most applicable. And one of the reasons for that is there's something very particular about different kinds of trauma. So, for example, it's a different thing to be a soldier who has killed people and feels terrible about it than to be having killed people in other kinds of settings. It's a different thing to be a survivor of sexual assault from someone you didn't know in a dangerous place than to have the exact same thing happen in a place that you normally feel safe from someone you knew and were, relied on in your life. There isn't a simple trauma. There isn't a single kind of a trauma. And the differences between the contexts that people are traumatized and their own personal history of traumatization and resilience has a big impact on something like suicide risk. So it may be that there is no single way to estimate the extent of the increased risk for suicide among people who have been traumatized. And maybe it's the case that there's not a uniform increase. There may be some people for whom these experiences are even protective against suicide. But overall, we know that when terrible things happen to people, generally speaking, it increases the risk for suicide.
So what are you most excited about in mental health treatment today?
Well, if you ask a neuroscientist that question, you're going to get answers about neuroscience. And, I actually...
I want the neuroscience answer.
Yeah.
I want the other one too, if you have another one.
Let me answer this in two ways. So the neuroscience answer, the single thing that I'm most excited about is this moment when we're just getting to the postmortem brain research. I think it's going to have a transformative impact on the field of PTSD research. It's going to open up all kinds of doors in terms of thinking about the complexity of the neurobiology of PTSD. I think it will ultimately point to new treatments that we couldn't have otherwise anticipated. And the whole field, I think, will mature in the context of this work in the way that we've seen fields like schizophrenia research, depression research, autism research develop. So the single thing that I'm most excited about today, Monday, about is that.
And wait, you said post-mortem. Can you explain?
Yes. Yeah. So true discovery science. We have a collection of brain tissues, and we can go to a part of the brain like the amygdala, and we can say, in people who have PTSD versus people who don't have PTSD or major depression, what genes in the nerve cells are turned on that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder? That's called transcriptomics, and that's the first step we've taken. We can also ask what factors are brought to bear to control the expression of those genes. So there's a process called, and I'm going to be very general about it, called epigenetics, meaning there's certain mechanisms that decide what genes get turned on and off. And we believe that life experiences like PTSD can exert their effects through epigenetics by engaging a set of mechanisms that change the pattern of gene expression in lasting ways in nerve cells and other brain cells. And those patterns may persist throughout all adult life. And so another set of studies where we have underway in certain parts of the brain are looking at starting to describe or map across the genome what genes are turned on or off by epigenetics. So these are two early examples of how we get such a granular, deep understanding of the response of the brain cells to psychological trauma in association with the symptoms of PTSD. That is a kind of level of biological resolution that we've never had before. One of the things that's really exciting about that is we can do a PET scan. We've already done this twice in PTSD. We can do a PET scan and we can measure, say, signatures of inflammation in the brain. And then we can look in the postmortem tissue to see whether we see the same signatures and get much more information about how inflammation occurs in the brain. We can do a PET scan of a particular neural signaling protein called the mGluR5 receptor. We find the mGluR5 receptor is increased in the brain in PTSD, particularly if you're suicidal. It's the first molecular biomarker of suicide that I've ever seen for PTSD. And what's interesting, it's only a marker for suicide risk in PTSD, not for major depressive disorder. And we can go back into the postmortem tissue. We can ask, how are the proteins associated with that receptor target regulated in the postmortem tissue? So in that study, we found a deeper understanding about why we see increased density of that receptor associated with PTSD symptoms. So it's opening up all kinds of new areas of studies. In some ways, it feels to me, I've been interested in PTSD since 1980. That's 40 years. And it feels to me like the research is just beginning again. You know, I feel like this is so exciting and it offers so many new opportunities to study PTSD that I just can't say how excited I am. But there's another part of the story, which is not so much about our research per se, but at a very macro societal level, which has been progressing. You know, when I got into this work, 1980, that was the year that the diagnosis of PTSD was created in DSM-3. And so PTSD literacy in our society at that was almost non-existent. And now, 40 years later, a lot of people know about PTSD. And a lot of clinicians know how to diagnose PTSD. And a lot of clinicians know how to treat PTSD. And a lot of people just in our society have heard the phrase psychological trauma or post-traumatic stress or something like that. And they know that if they have a bad experience and they have thoughts and nightmares and are uncomfortable in certain places, that maybe they should get help because there are treatments that can be helpful for those kinds of symptoms. And so the kind of expansion of cultural literacy, the development of tools that people can download from the National Center for PTSD website or from other sources that can advise people about how to recognize if they have signs of PTSD, that can advise people about where they can go to get help for PTSD, where that can educate people about the kinds of treatments that are available for PTSD. All of these are so important. In some ways, maybe at the macro scale and in the short run, maybe this is the most important advance that we've been able to achieve in our culture, which is to increase PTSD literacy, make sure that people have access to treatments that work, that could work. I mean, there's no guarantee that a given treatment will work for a given person, but has the possibility of working. And that if they're disabled by their PTSD, that is recognized as a legitimate source of medical disability, absolutely as legitimate as being disabled because both of your legs were cut off or because you had a heart attack or any other kind of medical problem. I think that understanding and getting the help you need is the first step toward recovery. And I think we're a lot farther down the road of being at a place where more and more people can recognize what they're going through and can find out how to get the help they need. And that's so, so important.
And I'd like to give credit to the VA's National Center for PTSD because it's really where, as a therapist, we really look to and really receive the best information. Don't you think?
Well, as a part of the National Center, I have to say, and I can join with you in celebrating their contributions because those have not been my contributions to the field. I think it's really been a remarkable resource for the field and not just for the veteran population, but the broader field of PTSD research. It's an amazing group of people who've been working really hard in a lot of different areas. And I believe that they have had a really important impact.
And it's also an important resource for people, for the public, because a lot of what they put on their website is very good information for the public. So if you had a magic wand and could improve one thing about mental health treatment today, what would it be?
Something that I find very troubling is the VA has created an incredible infrastructure for recognizing and treating PTSD. That infrastructure and that culture around trauma awareness and trauma assessment and trauma-related interventions is so far ahead of what's available once you leave the grounds of the VA in this country. And if I could wave a magic wand and raise the awareness about trauma and the literacy about trauma and the skills and the training around trauma and make that level of the VA spread across the whole country, I think maybe that would be the first thing that I would do.
I absolutely agree. So Dr. Krystal, on behalf of myself, my listeners, and all of the people that you've helped through your work, I want to thank you for your contributions to mental health treatment and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help me and my audience to better understand the field of neurobiology of PTSD.
You are most welcome. And thank you for inviting me to join you in this discussion. I've enjoyed it a great deal.
So be sure to check out my website, therapyshow.com, which has many resources about mental health, including a page on trauma and stress-related disorders, where there are links to Dr. Krystal's books and research. There you will also find out how to submit questions, stories, or insights that you have about the mental health system, or suggestions about who else I can interview and how I can improve the show. And I'd like to close by reminding our listeners to please subscribe, share, and review this podcast so you, someone you love, and people around the world can gain more benefit from therapy. There is no need to suffer in silence. Get the help that you need to create the life that you want.